Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is April 8th, 2024. Yes, Monday, April 8th, 2024, Eclipse Day. And our first story is a little bit strange, but the stranger the better, right? It's out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and it's titled The Cemetery Sentinel. If you visit a cemetery, you might have some trepidation, mostly because you don't want to come face to face with the restless shade of someone interred on the grounds. The last thing you expect will cross your path is a werewolf. A strange hybrid creature has been seen twice at an old cemetery in South London. British cryptid researcher Andy McGrath came across two eyewitnesses. His conversations with them made him wonder if they were mistaken, because the idea of a bipedal dogman seemed impossible. Whether the creature was real or not, it was dubbed the Werewolf of Camberwell. Andy McGrath, who considered himself a skeptic, is not sure exactly what the witnesses saw, but whatever it was frightened them profoundly. The second encounter occurred in 2004, and two persons described the event to him thus, quote, "We heard a low growl, then a large tree in the corner of the cemetery was shaking incredibly hard, as if something really powerful was shaking it with all its might. It was definitely not made by a person or an animal. The tree looked as if the roots were ready to be ripped out. My friend and I took to our heels and ran as fast as we could in different directions. We could not rationalize the sheer terror we both felt. We knew we had to get as far away from the cemetery as we possibly could. There is something very sinister there." End quote. The first encounter, dating to October 9th, 1996, was reported by a man who said his name was Gary, age 26, and it appeared on Linda Goffrey's blog. He said he took Underhill Road to meet a friend. This route brought him to Camberwell New Cemetery and through the length of Brenclake Garden, then around Camberwell Old Cemetery. He took a shortcut through the old cemetery, even though night had fallen. There was no lighting on the grounds, and he had no flashlight. This slowed him down a bit since he could only see a few feet in front of him. He normally rode his bike to meet his friend, but their plans would have made it inconvenient. Perhaps he wondered if taking the shortcut was a wise decision when halfway through the graveyard he saw the movement of something large. He said, "I swear I saw what I thought was a dog, a big dog, move very quickly. Like most persons, he thought it was his eyes and his imagination playing tricks on him, and he started off again with quickened steps." Gary described it as, quote, "It was then in a flash my life changed forever. It was so quick that I never had a chance. I thought that somebody had literally run into me and knocked me over. Something had grabbed me by my arm very tightly and smashed me to the ground. It was big, it was powerful, and it had extremely bad breath, and it smelled cold and awful. This thing was now bearing down on me, looking directly at my face, dribbling onto me and growling. I was convinced I was going to die. I am afraid to say that as brave as I think I might be, I was not at that point, and shamefully I soiled myself. As I lay there being smelled, I was waiting for the bite, but that never happened. Just as quick as it started, it was over and the beast was gone and sprinted off in a flash." End quote. The creature ran away on its hind legs, but this was after it had sniffed him thoroughly. Spared from what seemed to be a horror movie death, Gary believes he was discarded as a victim because he suffered from an illness that dogs can smell in humans. He said, "I truly believe it was this that the creature could smell on me. I think if I did not suffer from this, I would now be dead. I know some animals can smell sickness, and I'm sure they wouldn't eat anything infected if they could help it." Then he countered, "Maybe it had no intention of eating me at all. Maybe I was in its territory, and it was just scaring me to keep out." He described the creature as having a head like a German shepherd, which sat atop a muscular body. It growled deeply in its throat when it smelled him taking deep nasal sniffs. Its breath reeked of a sweetish scent of rotted fish. When asked how it held him, he described it this way, quote, "When it grabbed me, this is the horrible bit and makes my skin crawl. It was a hand that grabbed me. A big hand, human-like. Its whole hand went around my arm in a vice-like grip. I will argue till the day I die that it was a hand that grabbed me. I don't care who thinks that's mad. It seemed to me that it had long nails. If they were sharp, I can't confirm, but they were long and claw-like. If you had to grow nails to a similar length, they would protrude 5 to 6 inches from your hand with a slight inward curvature." End quote. Gary said he suffered from PTSD after the encounter, to the extent he took 6 months off from work. Like many who had a dogman encounter, he's terrified of woods. The only person he told about the incident was his wife. It goes without saying he avoided the cemetery from that day forward. Despite attempts to rationalize what he saw, such as it was someone wearing a costume, he can't discount the strength and speed it displayed. And the most worrisome of all is that it was bipedal. Old Camberwell Cemetery. Perhaps the setting for these encounters was not so happenstance. The graveyard is located on Forest Hill Road and started to receive burials in 1856. Three chapels demolished from the 1960s to 1970s once graced the grounds when it featured picturesque winding paths. Only a Gothic entrance lodge remains of the original buildings that were situated on 30 acres. By the late 19th century, it was in a neglected state, despite being enlarged. Despite being enlarged in 1874, it was then renamed Camberwell Old Cemetery. In 1878, Robert Wentworth Little, a distinguished Freemason who held the position of Secretary of the Royal Masonic Institution for Girls and also Deputy Provincial Grand Master for Middlesex, Grand Treasurer, and PGSG of Constantine, a member of the 30th degree of the Ancient and Accepted Rite, was interred there after dying from a lingering illness. He was also editor of the Rosicrucian and authored works on Freemasonry. He was buried in the Honor Oak section, and he was followed to the grave by a numerous body of both, among whom were many high dignitaries of the craft. After the coffin was lowered into the grave, the brethren scattered on it sprigs of acacia according to ancient custom. To Master Masons, it is a symbol of the immortality of the soul. Officially, the number of interments are cited as 30,000. During the 30 years its gates were opened. However, there are claims made in London newspapers dated to 1890 that upwards of 80,000 had been interred in 10 or 11 acres. During Victorian times, Sir F. Milner made a comment published in the local London newspapers in which it was customary to bury in St. Giles Camberwell Cemetery from 30 to 40 bodies of poor persons in one grave, which was sometimes kept open from 20 to 40 days after some bodies had been buried therein. The fear was the spread of a severe epidemic of influenza. This could account for the discrepancy of how many are truly buried in Old Camberwell Cemetery. In 1927, Beatrice May Butcher decided to commit suicide by taking carbolic poisoning on the grounds of Camberwell Cemetery. The reason being she had an unhappy married life, and a friend of hers had thrown himself in front of a train the previous evening. He had been found with his head smashed and his left hand cut off. And then I went to put on here the lyrics of Werewolf in London, which, in the context of this sighting, is I saw a werewolf with a Chinese menu in his hand walking through the streets of Soho in the rain. He was looking for a place called Li Ho Fook's. Gonna get a big dish of beef chow mein. And it goes on. And this is not the first time that I've read about a connection, for some reason, as unusual as it may sound, between sightings of dogmen and cemeteries. Very unusual because you would think was one thing have to do with the other, but if something does happen there, as far as is let's walk on the wild side here a minute. Perhaps these creatures come back and forth through rips and dimensions. A portal opens and closes. I don't know. And that's why you see them in the most unexpected places. And maybe there's something that, like they said in this description, the, when you had the burial of somebody like this Freemason, and he's got this beautiful monument and everything, these are the recognized burials that took place in the cemetery. In 1878, Robert Wentworth Little, because of course he had the full regalia of the funeral procession. But then it goes on, which is how many mass burials were there. Basically, yes, because of the fear of influenza, and they were just tossing bodies in a pit, which speaks to, like, you know like, nobody maybe said, I mean, even though it's a cemetery, nobody's had a ritual, no prayers, nothing. So yeah, that maybe there are mysterious things going on in this cemetery. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, besides seeing A werewolf or a dog man? And by the way, I do not blame that gentleman for never taking that shortcut again. I wouldn't either, for sure. Okay, the next story is titled "The Millionaire and the Telephone Girl," and this story it is true, and it occurred during the 1920s. And by the way, let me mention real quick: if you hear all these noises, because I'm doing this in the daytime, and I have all my exotic animals, which of course are never quiet. But yes, that's my background. I don't hear it anymore, but I'm sure people, what is that? That's my animals. But anyway, this story that occurred in France during the 1920s made headlines across the world because it had everything. It had murder, violence, sex, you name it. And it also has a flavor of the occult, as you will see, tied into the Friday the 13th superstition. Two officers of the Bicycle Police Brigade of Fresnes-sur-Marne were patrolling the road to Clay when they came in the night upon a smoldering hayrick in a field belonging to Farmer Ernay. Under the rick, about 100 feet off the main road and up a cart track, they smelled the odor of burning flesh. It was the body of a slender girl, and it was obvious by the charring of her body. Someone had set her on fire. I'm going to stop here real quick and point out that by the way, you're going to see that in the middle of this story, and I know this we're talking basically almost 100 years ago. It's not like now when there's internet and everything is instantaneous. Even this story around in the middle of this is playing out because it took several months for it to play out. Rudy Valentino, which was the what do you call it, the heartthrob, the equivalent of a rock and roll, um, the most famous star, the Chic and everything. He died, and his death, as famous as he was able to only pull the headlines away from this story that we're going to go into, like maybe a day or two. And then after that, I came right back to it. This is how much attention this took, as far as the public eye. Okay, so here it is. Police find this little town is on the outskirts of Paris. It's in the country, and they come by these, policemen, I guess, patrolled in a bicycle at that time, and they come to a smoldering stack of hay, and they find a burning body. On August 13th, 1926, a Friday, the police in the French city of Fresnes-sur-Marne were trying to solve what was dubbed by the press as the Friday the 13th murder. The body of a young girl was found in a burning haystack near a lonely road. The girl was strangled, and the fire was assumed to have been started to conceal the crime. Ironically, the spot where the body was discovered was called the Guarded Dead. A man seen driving a red automobile that stopped at a roadside cafe on the Paris-Meaux highway was believed to be the murderer. Initially, the victim's name was not known. The only clue was a laundry mark on the partially burned clothing. She was well dressed and looked to be in her early 20s. The authorities discovered the girl had stopped at a nearby roadside diner. Madame Lambeau, the proprietress, said the girl had told her a story in which a fortune teller had warned her that, quote, something terrible, quote, unquote, would happen to her on the 13th, but she laughed and said she wasn't worried. Her companion was a man of about 45 years of age. They were traveling in a red-brown Delage. Madame Lambeau described the girl as beautiful, with gray-green eyes and her hair bobbed in the latest style. She was gay and had even danced with her daughter. Less than a week later, the identities of the man and the girl were established. The police were combing Paris for a wealthy broker named Gaston Guillot for the murder of Marie-Louise Bulaguet, nicknamed Malou, who was a Paris telephone operator. Guillot was a purported millionaire and the son of the mayor of Provence. Right away, he was under suspicion for being a Bluebeard and killing his two wives, each which had died suddenly after being stricken seriously while on auto trips with him in the mountains. He escaped police from his Paris apartment, leaving a letter to his 16-year-old daughter Madeleine and the concierge that he was innocent, and declaring he would commit suicide before being taken. He was captured on August 20th, 1926 at New, a suburb of Paris. The one-eyed fugitive who used a glass eye due to an injury from the war was caught leaving a hotel on the Boulevard Montparnasse after sending a letter to police that they would never capture him. He admitted to giving the girl a ride in his limousine and was her companion at a roadside diner. The police theorized he was planning to contract a rich marriage, and the girl stood in his way. She was 20 years old, and she had been his mistress for 2 years. He paid for an apartment at 99 Avenue du Général Michel Bizot. It was 3 doors away from his own home. The investigation into Malou's murder had the Paris police take a closer look at the death of his 2 wives. In 1921, Guillot took his first wife, Augusta, to Candeville-le-Haut to visit her cousins, the Recouvreurs. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that. The story circulated at that time was that she died suddenly after taking ill. Now, one of the things that, as I keep going further, you're going to realize that the um, the difference, in other words, of the investigation when these his wives died supposedly by these supposedly kind of weird or unusual circumstances. The police departments, I guess, in these provinces, which I don't know if they just were not fully staffed or nobody wanted to believe that this gentleman, this with so much money, would kill one of his own wives. They they didn't investigate these things. They kind of like, oh, she killed herself or she did this, and nothing came of it. It wasn't until the Paris police stepped in that this gentleman, and you'll see as this goes out, how, that the discovery not only of this of killing his mistress, but what came with it. But anyway, so here the police, after this, they capture Guillot. They go and they speak to Martin Recouvreur, who was a cousin of his first wife, who supposedly committed suicide while staying with him. And he says to the police, quote, Guillot and Augusta occupied a room upstairs. We sleep on the first floor. In the evening before Augusta's death, Guillot and I had a conversation, which has since impressed me. I met him in the courtyard near the well, and he stopped me. Is it wise to leave the lid of the well open? He asked me. And I said, sort of joking, why not? There are no children here. None of us is going to jump in, I hope. I don't know about that, said Guillot with a strange expression. He said his wife was a neurasthenic. This term was used by the alienists of the day to describe a person with an exhausted central nervous system. Now the story continues. Strangely, even though Augusta Guillot was found with a bullet in her head, her cousins heard no shot and attributed it to the thick walls of the farmhouse. He described how Guillot had appeared like a ghost at their bedroom door sometime after midnight and calmly announced, what I feared has happened. Augusta has killed herself. The date was July 16th, 1921. Martin Recouvreur told police, I never had any suspicions of Guillot. The police doctor showed me how my cousin had probably lain in bed with a pistol hid under the clothes waiting for her husband to sleep so that she could kill herself without interference. Augusta was the mother of his daughter, and within 3 years he married Georgette Barbichon, a widow, but she too died mysteriously only 5 months after the wedding. Again, the story was she took sick during an auto trip while visiting the Côte d'Azur. After this, he moved to Paris. He sent his daughter to an expensive boarding school, and part of the time she lived with her paternal grandfather in the provinces. However, at the time of the investigation, she had come to spend the holiday with her father. He declared to the magistrate that he had met Marie-Louise in May 1925 in Paris. She worked as a telephone operator. He would meet the young woman, who was only a few years older than his daughter, every 15 days in Paris. He said she had a detestable character and accused her of having other lovers in the country and in Paris. He explained that what precipitated the death of Malou was an argument. She told him that she had an offer of marriage, and that if he didn't marry her, she would accept it. The dispute escalated, and then, quote, at one time during the argument, which had become very violent, she slapped me several times, and I retaliated with a pretty stiff punch. Starting my car, I seized her by the throat and squeezed it violently. She cried out like a polecat, and all of a sudden fainted. I saw her stiffen my arms with her head leaning back, so I felt her pulse, and I found that her heart had ceased to beat. I again started my car, and several miles further on I saw in a field a large haystack. I drove my car near to it and dragged the body of Marie Louise and placed it against the stack. I then threw a match into the hay, then I hurried back to Paris. End quote. Later, Guillot changed the reason for the argument, stating Malou was madly jealous of his daughter. She had been pressing him to marry her, but he agreed only after his daughter had married. Later was learned that Guillot's father, who turned him over to the police, believed he was innocent. But when he heard of his son's confession, he was ashamed as he had a reputation of being a lawful man. And this was only the beginning, since his son came under suspicion of committing many unsolved crimes besides this one. More information was given out about the death of his second wife. She had died in Monte Carlo, and he telegraphed her family to say she died of the influenza. But the Monaco authorities held an inquest at which the conclusion was reached that death was due to poison, probably self-administered. Members of her family declared that before starting on the trip, Guillot persuaded them to sign a paper relinquishing all claims to a share of his wife's estate in the event of any ill befalling her on the journey, in consideration of a sum of $200. The estate amounted to more than £2,000. I'm sorry, in consideration of a sum of £200, and the estate amounted to more than £2,000. The Paris police decided to hold an official inquiry in connection with the death of the two wives of Gaston Guillot. It came to light that both of his wives were shot dead with a revolver, although none of the members of their family knew the truth of their deaths. Guillot told the parents of his first wife she committed suicide. Ironically, the revolvers used had been gifts Guillot had given each of them. He told the parents of the second one that she died from influenza or a heart attack, when in truth she was found shot in a hotel at Monte Carlo, where, owing to the authorities' dislike for any publicity in case of supposed suicide, it was easy for the husband to obtain a death certificate. Guillot told his friend she killed herself because she'd lost a great deal of money at the casino gambling tables. Guillot was also charged with attempting to set fire to standing crops, an offense punishable in France with penal servitude for life. Later he denied this, saying he had just emptied his pipe and the fire was accidental. Malou's body was exhumed and re-examined, and showed she had been subjected to considerable violence, her nose and arms being badly bruised and her throat fractured. The bodies of his former wives were also exhumed. The bad luck of killing his last victim on Friday the 13th grew exponentially when Guillot was being looked at for the mysterious death of a young girl 15 years before at Chauvin, where his father lived. The girl was strangled at a time when Guillot was doing his military service there, and she had been raped. On August 28, 1926, Guillot went out to the countryside 25 miles outside of Paris, where he reenacted the scene that led to the death of Marie. There were 1,500 attendees who brought picnic lunches to the spectacle. While the drama of this murder took place, Rudolph Valentino died unexpectedly in the United States, and the case was dropped from international headlines, but only for a few days. The authorities later learned that the relationship with Guillot and his mistress was a troubled one, and they argued often. He wrote a letter several months before to a friend where he said, "Marie-Louise can desert me if she likes, but I cannot desert her. You know why." The case of the second wife was especially engaging to the authorities, since in those years the statute of limitation had run out for the murder of his first wife. Georgette Guillot had died in February 1925, and by then Malou was already his sweetheart. They wondered what was the secret that his mistress knew about him, where it seemed he feared to just cast her off and had to resort to killing her. The bad luck of the 13th continued to haunt him, when by the end of September 1926, Monsieur Guillot was accused of the following crimes. 1. Murder of his two wives, which he explained as suicides. 2. Killing of a mail carrier on the highway by running over him with his auto and leaving the scene. 3. Assault and murder of a 15-year-old in the fields near his father's home at Louan near Meaux. 4. Seduction of scores of young girls of peasant families, many who mysteriously disappeared and were acquaintances of his first wife. 5. Set fire to wheat crops. 6. Participation in the robbery of £1.5 million from the Paris Belfort Express in February 1926. 7. A railway robbery in 1921. And 8. Dozens of cases of criminal arson. By November, it became evident that Guillot was not in reality a successful speculator, and his lavish expenditures led him to ask aid from his parents on numerous occasions. It turned out that his debts exceeded 1 million francs. In July 1921, a few weeks before the death of his first wife, a combination train consisting of passengers and freight cars was held up 1 mile from Luan by a party of automobile bandits in concert with Confederates who had taken passage in the train. The robbery occurred on the one day of the month when the baggage car of this local train carried payroll sacks. The robbers took a £500,000, and it was theorized it was masterminded by someone familiar with local affairs. At the time, the police followed without success a report that Guillot was seen to jump from the train 30 minutes after the robbery, when it had resumed its trip and was entering the station at Luan. In 1921, 1923, 1924, and 1925, the Luan Brigade investigated suspicious fires, which destroyed stored crops. Guillot was under suspicion as all the victims were clients of his Paris grain jobbing house. The local police believed that Guillot and his clients had set the fires for the purpose of recovering insurance. Over 10 million francs were paid out to the insured. Guillot was being compared to Henri Décidé Landru, who had been called the Bluebeard of Gambay. Between December 1915 and January 1919, he killed at least 7 women. He also killed 3 women and 1 of their sons in the house he rented from December 1914 to August 1915 in the town of Vernouillet. Authorities suspected he killed many more than were ever discovered. He seduced these women, convinced them to sign a power of attorney, and then killed them. Afterwards, he burned their bodies in his stove. Landru was guillotined just before dawn on February 20th, 1922, outside the gates of the prison Saint-Pierre in Versailles. He was interred in the Le Gonard Cemetery in a grave marked only with a wooden cross and the name Henri Décidé. Later, his children changed their surname to Remy. Within 2 months, Landru's grave became a regular stop on the sightseeing tours about Versailles. It started when a young American girl unpinned a bouquet from her corsage and placed the violets on the mound. The French ridiculed the Americans for their morbidity. Then in April 1922, examining magistrate Bonan, who prepared the case against Landru, died. It was reported that Landru predicted if he were guillotined, Bonin would die within 3 months. On Halloween 1927, while the country was riveted with Guillot's murder trial, the lease on Landru's grave expired. Due to non-payment, the cross and the hedge marking his resting place was removed. He was exhumed and reburied in another part of the cemetery, where those who had been executed by guillotine were laid to rest, thus leaving him to an unnamed grave. Guillot went to trial before the Melun Assize Court on a charge of murder in July 1927. Doctors testified that Malou had not been dead when she was thrown into the hay rick and set on fire, as some fumes had been found in her lungs. This was later contradicted by another physician. Dr. Paul, a police doctor who had performed more than 34,000 autopsies, challenged Guillot's description that he had strangled Malou with one hand, while he drove after they had quarreled. Dr. Haloun, who examined the girl's body with Dr. Paul, determined that she had not died within a few minutes, but only after a long struggle. Bruises on the arms and other marks showed that there was a face-to-face struggle and that he had used both of his hands. She was killed while standing up, not sitting down. It was called an affaire passionnelle, even though Guillot was unfaithful to his own mistress with several women. Judge Sugier, who presided over the trial, asked him about the death of his 2 wives. Guillot said his first wife killed herself because she thought she had cancer, and his second because of her gambling losses. The judge responded, "Generally, when destiny commences to rain blows on a man, it shows more ingenuity." It came out during the trial that Guillot wanted to get rid of his mistress because he had plans to marry the sister of one of his 2 wives, who had money. His lack of funds always coincided with the so-called suicides of his wives, who with their deaths left him flush with money again. Guillot had not suffered in his upbringing. He was the son of a rich and respectable farmer who had inherited a small fortune from his mother. He moved to Paris and indulged in debauchery. While keeping Marie Louise as a mistress, he carried on an affair with his own servant and his brother's widow. He boasted of conquering hundreds of other women. By the time he was discovered as a cold-blooded killer, he had spent his fortune of 2 million francs. Guillot made a list of killers who were known to be kind to animals. When it became known, he had showered his dogs with care and affection. On July 22, 1927, Guillot was found guilty and sentenced to death. The courts awarded 50,000 francs to the mother of the murdered girl. The death sentence was appealed by his attorney. His appeal was denied in November 1927. It wasn't until January 1928 that Guillot was given a reprieve when President Dumergue commuted his sentence to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. The American press made fun of the fact that he was considered a romantic murderer, and due to this he escaped the guillotine. In those years, a sentence to this island prison in French Guiana was in effect a death sentence, but considered better than being beheaded in public. The prison opened in 1852 and was notorious for the harsh treatment of the guards and the diseases produced by the tropical climate. At a death rate of 75%, nothing more was ever heard of Monsieur Guillot, and if he survived his stay in Devil's Island, the prison closed in 1953. So there you go. He got spared the guillotine, but he was sent to Devil's Island. I wonder if there was times when he was on Devil's Island that he would have wished he would have been executed. Who knows? And again, he was very lucky that they gave him a chance and let him, at least, I don't know, like, what is it, like like Papillon, try to make a break for it, shark infested. Yeah, I believe that's another thing about the Devil's Island, that it not only was it the tropical climate, the disease, but if you tried to escape, the waters around it are shark infested. Let's go on now to this article out of the conversation, and it's titled Neanderthals died out 40,000 years ago, but there has never been more of their DNA on Earth, as in like now. I should know. I have 3% Neanderthal. Anyway, here we go. Neanderthals have served as a reflection of our own humanity since they were first discovered in 1856. What we think we know about them has been shaped and molded to fit our cultural trends, social norms, and scientific standards. They have changed from diseased specimens to primitive subhuman lumbering cousins to advanced humans. We now know Homo neanderthalis were very similar to ourselves, and we even met them and frequently interbred. But why did they go extinct? While we survived, flourished, and ended up taking over the planet. Neanderthals evolved over 400,000 years ago, most likely from an earlier ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis. They were extremely successful and spread across an area from the Mediterranean to Siberia. They were highly intelligent, with brains on average bigger than Homo sapiens. They hunted for big game, collected plants, fungi, and seafood, controlled fire to cook, made composite tools, made clothes from animal skins, made beads from shells, and were able to carve symbols onto cave walls. They took care of their young, old, and weak, created shelters for protection, lived through harsh winters and warm summers, and they buried their dead. Neanderthals did meet our ancestors on several occasions over the course of tens of thousands of years, and the two species shared the European continent for at least 14,000 years. They even mated with each other. The most significant difference between Neanderthals and ourselves is that they were extinct about 40,000 years ago. The precise cause of their demise still eludes us, but we think it was probably the result of a combination of factors. First, the climate of the last ice age was very variable, shifting from cold to warm and back again, which put pressure on animal and plant food sources and meant Neanderthals constantly had to adapt to environmental change. Second, there were never that many Neanderthals, with the overall population never exceeding the tens of thousands. They lived in groups of 5 to 15 individuals, compared with Homo sapiens that had groups of up to 150 individuals. These small, isolated Neanderthal populations may have been increasingly genetically unsustainable. Third, there were competition with other predators, particularly the groups of modern humans that emerged from Africa about 60,000 years ago. We speculate that many Neanderthals may have been assimilated into the larger bands of Homo sapiens. Neanderthals left numerous traces for us to examine tens of thousands of years later, much of which can be seen at the special exhibition curated at the Natural Museum of Denmark. Over the past 150 years, they have collected fossil bones, stones, and wooden tools, trinkets, and jewelry that were left behind. They uncovered burials and now map their genome from ancient DNA. It seems that 99.7% of Neanderthal and modern human DNA is identical, and they are our closest extinct relatives. Perhaps the most surprising fact was evidence of interbreeding that has left traces of DNA in living humans today. Many Europeans and Asians have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, while African people south of the Sahara have almost zero. Ironically, with the current world population of about 8 billion people, this means that there has never been more Neanderthal DNA on Earth. The Neanderthal genome also helps us understand more of what they look like, as there's evidence that some Neanderthals evolved pale skin and red hair long before Homo sapiens. The many genes that are shared between Neanderthals and modern humans are linked to anything from the ability to taste bitter foods to the capacity to speak. We have also increased our knowledge of human health. For instance, some Neanderthal DNA that might have been beneficial to humans tens of thousands of years ago now seems to cause issues when combined with a modern Western lifestyle. There are links to alcoholism, obesity, allergies, blood clotting, and depression. Recently, scientists suggested an ancient gene variant form Neanderthals might increase the risk of serious complications from contracting COVID 19. Like the dinosaur, the Neanderthals didn't know what was coming. The difference is that the dinosaurs disappeared suddenly following a giant meteorite hit from outer space. To the Neanderthals, extinction happened gradually. They eventually lost their world, a comfortable home they had successfully occupied for hundreds of thousands of years that slowly turned against them, until existence itself was unsustainable. In that sense, Neanderthals now serve a different purpose. We see a reflection in them. They didn't know what was happening to them, and they had no choice but to continue down the road that eventually led to extinction. We, on the other hand, are painfully aware of our situation and the impact that we have on things around us. If we don't want to end up like Neanderthals, we better get our act together. Now, I personally think that I agree with that part where the Neanderthals didn't just die away. I think that, like they said, because of the small groups, they were. I think they were absorbed into groups of as their numbers shrunk. What was left of them just interbred and be, were assimilated into groups of modern man until I don't think they just all died out. I think that that's what they did. So in a way, they didn't really terminate their existence. They just were blended into the fabric of humans of that time. All right, let's get on to let's read something about cowboys. This is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled Wyoming's Wraiths and Outlaws. Wyoming Frontier Prison is known as the Old Pen, with a reputation of being the most haunted prison in the state. That says a lot right there. Oh boy, here we go. Let me go back over here. Of all the inmates that were held there, one of the most grisly and psychopathic was Andrew Pixley, who was executed in the gas chamber in 1965. It's claimed he's not moved on from where he met his demise, and justice was served. However, the area is rich in a history of bloodthirsty outlaws. In 1872, desperados caught breaking the law in Wyoming were sent to serve their sentence at the Wyoming Territorial Prison, which opened in 1872 as a U.S. penitentiary on 190 acres. Later became Wyoming's first state penitentiary. For the next 30 years, it was known as the Big House across the river. Serving time in the prison was harsh, but by comparison to what happened to some outlaws, it was preferable. Such is the case of the fate of Big Nose George. In December 1880, George Perot, aka Parrot, or George Francis Warden, a Frenchman who went by the alias of Big Nose George or George Ogronez, was a notorious road agent and murderer who received an invite for a necktie party scheduled for April 2nd, 1881. The most egregious of his crimes was the killing of 2 deputy sheriffs. In August 1880, Sheriff Rankin from Carbon County had arrested George at Miles City. He was a member of a gang of train robbers who on August 13th, 1878 killed 2 deputy sheriffs named Robert Whittlefield and Henry Tip Vincents at Elk Mountain, Wyoming. The deputies were in pursuit of the gang at the time and were ambushed and murdered by the outlaws. The sentiment of the citizens of Carbon, where the men were known as highly respected citizens, was strongly against the perpetrators. Shortly after the murder, Charles Bates Barres, alias Dutch Charlie, was captured en route from Laramie to Rawlins, where he was taken from the train at Carbon by a number of masked men. He was hanged at a telegraph post. The act was condemned by the citizenry, but the newspapers noted it was richly deserved. Sheriff Rankin, warned by what had happened to Dutch Charlie 2 years before, kept a sharp eye out when he was near Carbon, since he feared Big Nose George would suffer the same fate. His sole purpose was to get his prisoner to stand trial for his crimes in a court of law. However, the friends of Whittlefield and Vincent got in their work and were waiting for an opportunity to accomplish their mission. Rankin took the precaution of giving the keys to the prisoner's shackles and handcuffs to G.C. Smith, the prosecutor from Carbon County, who was on the train as well. They rolled into town after nightfall when, without warning, the car was filled with masked and armed men. The sheriff was disarmed, and he was searched for the keys. Big Nose George, who saw what was happening, snatched a revolver from the hands of one of the men who had him, but he was overpowered. Without the keys, a sledgehammer was used to crush the shackles, and the masked men dragged Big Nose George out of the car to a nearby corral. He was hoisted up until he confessed to everything, including that he was part of the gang who killed the deputies, along with Dutch Charlie. He was taken back to the train and delivered to the sheriff. One of the train passengers was an English nobleman who said while the sheriff was being held down, "Mr. Sheriff, I sympathize with you, indeed I do." "Shut up, you!" An expletive. One of the masked guarded one of the masked guards responded, and a revolver was thrust into his face. "I beg pardon, gentlemen. I only wanted to sympathize with the sheriff." He then retired hastily. The masked men had planned well, holding the engineer and fireman, while other held the conductor inside the express car. The train was delayed about 30 minutes. Memories were long in those times and in these parts. While Big Nose George was being held in a jail cell, it was remembered there were stage robberies on the Cheyenne and Deadwood Stage Road. Boone May, a messenger on the line, had killed Frank Toole. It was said by those who knew the truth of the matter that Toole was with the Elk Mountain gang when the 2 deputies were killed. The gangs had made various attempts to wreck passenger trains on the Union Pacific Railroad, and a reward of $2,000 was offered by Carbon County for their capture, dead or alive, and guaranteed by the railroad. Once Big Nose George verified that Toole had been part of the gang, Boone received the reward. This original gang had formed in the Powder River country and included Big Nose George, Joe Manus, Frank McKinney, Jack Campbell, Sim John, John Wells aka Sandy, Tom Reed, Frank Toole, and Dutch Charlie Bates. Prior to his trial in 1880, Big Nose George said that McKinney claimed to be Frank James, and that Sim John was the leader of the gang. This led to speculation that Frank and Sim were actually Frank and Jesse James. It probably was not true, since McKinney was most likely Reddy McKinney. Fast forward to the spring of 1881, and even though George Perot was slated to be executed in April, on March 23rd, masked men stormed the jail at night where he was being held. He was strung up to a telegraph pole opposite the railroad machine shops. He asked to be shot, but instead they hung him, while he choked to death instead of breaking his neck. He was left hanging on the telegraph pole until the coroner could reach Carbon the next day. In August 1881, Governor Morgan received a letter from the Consulate General of France, on behalf of George Perrault's white widow, asking for a certificate of his death. Apparently, his origins were French. Being the most hated man in town, the populace decided to add insult to injury, and instead of burying George, they donated his body to the local physician. Dr. Osborne wanted to discover whether the outlaw's skull and brain, this was something called phrenology, was different from non criminals. He made a death mask of George, then skinned and dismembered the body. He sawed off the top of the skull, which gave to Dr. Lillian Heath, wife of Lou Nelson of Rawlins. The skin was sent to a tanner, and a portion from his thighs was made into a pair of shoes. The chest skin was made into a medicine bag. Who would use this stuff? Anyway, eventually, Dr. Osborne immersed the skull and other bones in a saline solution in a whiskey barrel, which he buried in the yard of his office. Dr. Osborne was not only practiced medicine, but became the largest individual sheep owner in the territory. He was also board chairman of the Rawlins National Bank, and he served in the territorial, state, and national offices. He served as mayor of Rawlins, then as governor of Wyoming, after the first governor, Francis E. Warren, resigned to serve in the Senate. Osborne died on April 24, 1943. In May 1950, some workmen digging an excavation for a store building on West Cedar Street unearthed a large barrel. Inside were the grim remains of George Parrott. There were human bones, including a skull with its top sawed off, along with shoes with glass nails and a bottle of vegetable compound. By 1899, the small town of Carbon was bypassed by the railroad after they reconstructed their route to Nebraska. By 1902, the mines at Carbon had closed and the town was gradually abandoned, with the last persons leaving around 1912. As a typical ghost town, present day, the roads, mine ruins, the roadbed for the Union Pacific Railroad, and foundations are all that's left of Carbon. In the process of Carbon being abandoned, the Wyoming Territorial Prison closed its doors in 1903 after 30 years of housing outlaws and desperados. This is when the Wyoming Frontier Prison opened its doors. Eventually, this prison became known as the Old Pen. Despite its new construction, the 104 cells had no running electricity or water. For many years, the average temperature was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Violent offenders, many who were slated to die by hanging or in the gas chamber, were housed there before their final departure from this world. A total of 14 were executed at the prison, 9 by hanging and 5 in the gas chamber. It held women until 1909, then afterward female prisoners were shipped to Colorado. It closed its doors in 1980 and opened as a museum in 1988, becoming a favorite destination for ghost tourism. Employees and tourists describe feelings of being watched with hostile eyes. For some visitors, the feeling has chased them out of the building. Many believe it's the ghost of a young drifter who committed a heinous crime. Andrew Pixley was a 21-year-old dropout who drifted to Wyoming from Oregon. He served 18 months in the Army, mostly overseas. He drifted around and got a job as a dishwasher at the Wirt Hotel in Jackson. He lived in a trailer with 2 hotel employees, David Starling and Orville Edwards. Starling was said to have had prior knowledge of Pixley's violent disposition, even though the young man had been working there only 2 weeks. On the night of August 7, 1964, Pixley stacked a woodpile against the back wall of the hotel, took off his shoes, and climbed onto a thin ledge. He opened the screen to a room on the second floor, which was occupied by Debbie McAuliffe, 12, and her sisters Cindy, 8, and Susan, 6. Judge Robert McAuliffe and his wife, the girls' parents, were spending time at the hotel lounge. But when management told them there were noises coming from inside the room, they returned and opened the door and found their worst nightmare had become reality. Debbie was beaten to death and lying on her bed. Cindy was strangled, and a slim man was lying shirtless on the floor of the room, covered in their daughter's blood. Both girls were sexually assaulted, and Susan was saved by the arrival of her parents. Debbie had been bludgeoned with a rock, and Cindy was beaten and strangled. The father seized the stranger, and a crowd soon gathered, drawn by his wife's screams. The police arrived as a mob called out for a lynching. Andrew Pixley, real name Armando Benavides, claimed that from the time of his arrest until his execution, he had no memory of what he had done to the girls. Later he said, "If I did something like that, I deserve everything I get." He was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico on January 29, 1943, to Armando C. Benavides and Benita Benny Pena. His mother abandoned the family when he was 2 years old after the death of her 4-month-old daughter Mabel. Andrew was the third of 4 children she had given birth to. Her first son, Francisco, died in 1939 when he was 1 year old. Then she gave birth to Agapita, who, by the way, died in 2005. His father died from tuberculosis when he was 4 years old. He and his sister, Agapita Pena Benavides, were placed into the foster care system. Pixley described where some placements were good and others were bad. He once had to sleep in a doghouse with a Labrador named Pooch. When he was 13 years old, his mother reclaimed him and his sister from the system. She had married Columbus F. Pixley, a lumberjack, and she took them to Oregon to live. Pixley was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in February 1965. He was tried only for the murder of Deborah McAuliffe, but he admitted to the slaying of her sister Cynthia. During his 3-day trial, he laughed openly, and Robert McAuliffe shouted, "Laugh some more, you animal." The parents described finding both girls nude and one of them missing her nose, leading to the belief Pixley might have bit it off and had cannibalized the bodies. Dr. William Carn Jr., the medical director of the Wyoming State Hospital, who had examined Pixley for a month to determine if he was sane, said that it meant a lot more to Pixley to kill the girls while they were awake rather than while they were sleeping. McAuliffe was so enraged he tried to attack Pixley during this part of the testimony. Carn described Pixley as a man who hated society. A sociopath is sick in getting along with the outside world. He hates the human race, himself included. The psychiatrist described Pixley as one of the sickest we've ever seen sociopathically. He said chances to rehabilitate Pixley were absolutely nil. Pixley spent 11 months on death row and expressed a desire to die. He got his wish on December 10th, 1965, when he was strapped to a chair in the gas chamber. He laughed when the execution date was announced. He occupied the same cell as Henry Rule, who was convicted in 1944 of killing Matt Catmull, a Cheyenne war worker. Pixley was the first execution in 20 years. He also took the longest time to die than any other executed person in the Wyoming gas chamber. It took him 7 minutes to expire. During his incarceration, Pixley had tried to carve the faces of his 2 victims in the wall of the cell. In November 1965, Pixley's mother, Benita Pixley, and his stepfather wrote to the governor for clemency, but it was not granted. His last visitors were his stepfather and his sister, Agapita or Aggie Owens. Neither one of them attended the execution. He willed his eyes to an eye bank at the University of Colorado's medical school, and they were removed right after his death. His burial details remained unknown. Debbie and Cindy McAuliffe were buried together in a single casket and interred in Queen of Heaven's Catholic Cemetery in Chicago, Illinois. Their parents later filed suit against the Wirt Hotel in order to pay for the surviving child's psychiatric treatment. The McAuliffes divorced, and the judge remarried and had a son. Robert McAuliffe died in 1998 and Betty McAuliffe in 2010. Their youngest daughter, Susan, married and had 5 children. Employees of the prison claim that the spirit of Andrew Pixley still roams the prison. Many refuse to go anywhere near his cell, believing the picture of the young man that hangs over his bunk watches them, claiming his cold, dead shark eyes follows whoever passes by. Others have claimed to hear his voice from beyond the grave, confessing his crime as he laughs. Other witnesses have heard the sounds of young girls crying coming from the gas chamber. Another spirit that is seen is that of a ghost cat. This black cat was executed in the gas chamber as a test run to make sure the chamber had no leaks before Pixley's sentence was carried out. There are sightings of other ghosts. The Wirt Hotel where the murder was committed is also said to be haunted, some say by the 2 girls. The hotel burned down and was rebuilt. However, the rooms that were built in the original spot where the murder room was situated claim that these rooms have the most maintenance problems. The hotel is said to be haunted by a one-time maintenance engineer named Bob Tomingus, who worked there in 1950. He was known for fixing the impossible. Current maintenance personnel believe he helps out when something needs fixing, since he knew the location of wirings, pipes, valves, and all the secrets of the hotel after working there for 45 years. Bob died in 1999. So there you go. a very haunted prison who's been around for a very long time. I will see you all soon with another batch of eerie news.